Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this installment of your award-winning Wham City Lecture Series. Tonight, we're talking about two things which many people think have nothing to do with each other. But I think over the course of the evening, we'll see that they do. These things are pigeons and catchings. The first speaker tonight, Lucia Treasure, I had no idea she even knew anything about pigeons. I knew her from working at Center Stage. I saw her in the video store all the time. She works for the film festival. So I thought of her as a movie person. And then one day she came up and she said, I'd like to talk about pigeons. A thing that I never even have ever thought about. So, without further ado, Lucia Treasure talking about pigeons.
Hey folks. Hey Lucia. I'm really excited to talk about pigeons. So I'll tell you before I get rolling, and I'll get rolling. I'll tell you that I'm not a scientist, and I'm an amateur sociologist at best. But this lecture is going to be mostly about the pigeon, America's sexiest bird. But most of all, it's about our relationship with pigeons and their relationship with us, which I believe is pretty damn symbiotic. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about has to do with the way that our lives and their lives intersect, basically. So before I get started, tell me something. What do you think of when you think of pigeons?
Shit.
Shit? Shitty? Iridescence. Iridescence?
Male.
What's that?
The male.
The male. Okay.
Flight.
Flight?
Chasing.
Chasing.
Those smoky things that they put on ledges.
Very good. We're going to cover those. Anything else?
Animaniacs.
And very good. That's those are good pigeon characters. Yeah, so that's good. Nobody said rats with wings. You must be trying to be nice to me. Well, we're going to cover that too. I am a huge pigeon fan. I don't think you get a bigger pigeon fan than I. And my friends in the room, I'm surprised they're here because I have talked them deaf about pigeons throughout our friendship. And so this comes from that direction in terms of how special and how much they have and how much a part of our history they've become. So pigeons are a kind of rock dove, which has the scientific name Columbia livia. Doves are a kind of pigeon. Everything that is related to Columbia livia or a rock dove is considered a pigeon. So when you hear me use references to pigeons that you might go, hey asshole, that's a dove. Hey asshole, back at you, dove is a pigeon. So something that we all know is that most birds come from dinosaurs, and something that's really interesting that we discovered in the last year or so, or are thinking about, is that dinosaurs had feathers, maybe? Yes, so, thank you, sir. So, when you think about pigeons, you can think about, as this type of bird. They have this old genus that goes way, way back. Some early pigeon history for you. Pigeons are thought to have originated, since they're called rock doves because their natural origin, their natural habitat is in high up cliffs, sitting in nests nestled inside of the high up places inside of little cliffs, or big cliffs, little nests and big cliffs. And so they come from places that had those types of terrain. So it's thought that pigeons started off in southern Asia, and as hordes would conquest across Asia into northern Africa, they arrived there. And then as conquestors from northern Africa moved up into Europe, that's where they went to Europe. Additionally, Iran, which was once Persia and what's considered the seat of civilization, is another place that had an early origin of pigeons, which is understandable given, again, the terrain that hosts them so well. So from there, as the progression moved from northern Africa into Europe, they were really well fostered in France and Belgium. And it was the French that brought them over to the New World, or here. So that gives you a sense of how we have them now. The symbiosis, there's a very simple explanation that I could just say, and we can stop the lecture right here, which is that from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, we drop our shit on the ground all the time. We drop food, we drop trash. And so places like Trafalgar Square, the great famous center in Venice, that have these large gathering places for pigeons, are that because they were these common places where people would drop their shit on the ground for centuries. So to just get a sense, like that's how we sort of begin to understand how we have a symbiosis with pigeons. We have really great relationships with pigeons. This is one of my favorite Sesame Street sketches. In this one, Bertie is pretty impressed that Bernice, this pigeon here, can play checkers. And Bert says, well, it ain't so great. And Ernie's like, what do you mean? And Bert said, well, she only beat me twice. Pigeons are really smart, which is something we're going to cover as well. We see them in all kinds of artistic references. Finding it. We have movie references like On the Waterfront, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Jim Jarmusch's Ghost Dog, The Way of the Samurai, Blade Runner. Every single John Woo movie you will ever see explodes in a flight of pigeons in its climax. And finally, we have Woody Allen's Stardust Memories, in which he probably didn't coin, but definitely popularized the term rats with wings for pigeons in the early 80s. He also has this essay, which my mother once told me about, and I certainly couldn't find it, but it's in which he decides that he's in New York, he's like, oh my God, pigeons, they're so ubiquitous, they're so everywhere, let me try to chase them. And he goes to chase a pigeon. He actually kicked the pigeon, and the pigeon died. One of many mistakes in Woody Allen's life. There are amazing references to pigeons in art. Picasso was mesmerized by pigeons. He devoted a whole section of his career to painting pigeons. He also named his daughter Paloma, which is the Spanish word for pigeon. We have one really close to us, a block away. Our own Gaia did this incredible mural to kick off the Open Walls Project, which is hands holding a white pigeon. And he said this thing about it, which I really love. He says, the carrier pigeon perched within a hand is an image that I have revisited many times in the past year. Much like the hybridized creatures I have produced in the past, this gesture displays a moment of domination and submission, but also of steward and nature. Pigeons are beautiful creatures, and one of the few that can tolerate the city. This print is a celebration of a dying urban sport and of an unsung animal. We see pigeon reference, there are so many songs with pigeons in them. Some of the more famous ones would include Tom Lehrer's Poisoning Pigeons in the Park. No Pigeons, a little rebuttal to a song by TLC called No Scrubs by a little less memorable band than TLC called the Sporty Thieves. There's Feed the Birds and Mary Poppins. There's Doin' the Pigeon by Bert, who is now gone. And so I see pigeon references in art almost every day now, which is always a good time for me. Pigeons are really, one aspect of pigeons that we're just going to keep revisiting here is their homing nature, which is basically has a lot to do with how we have both a symbiotic and somewhat combative relationship with pigeons in urban climates. But some interesting things about early aspects of homing. Every single army in this world, of every nation in this world, has utilized the homing instinct of pigeons to deliver messages because it's in many ways so much more effective and efficient than a lot of the other ones we've developed even to this day. But way back, you had soldiers, pigeons have a natural instinct to find land, so you would have sailors on ships who, if they thought they were lost at sea, would throw up a pigeon and see which way it went, and then follow it. All the way back to the story of Noah's Ark, in which a pigeon was the first sign that land was where Noah was going to arrive. The ancient Egyptians developed pigeon messaging to announce the ascension of a new pharaoh, and on and on. So pigeons are known for their ubiquity. We know that they have, the things that are really interesting about them, things we have in common with them. They mate for life. They have a wonderful and affectionate courting ritual. They bond and they engage in social flocking, which again has a lot to do with why they flock with us so much. They, as we are social creatures, so are they. We mix together very naturally this way. And we also see a lot of religious reference to pigeons. In the First Testament, the Hebrew Song of Solomon makes great reference to pigeon. God is said to seal his covenant with Abraham by requesting the sacrifice of one squab, which is how you talk with a pigeon when you're going to eat it. The pigeon in the New Testament was said was used to symbolize the Holy Spirit. So like there are these paintings of God being like, oh, and this light comes down from heaven and a pigeon flies out of it right into Mary's belly. And we have the Holy Spirit, and that's how Mary got pregnant. It was a pigeon. And thus after the birth of Jesus, God asked for the sacrifice of one pigeon from Joseph and Mary, which was a poor man's sacrifice in that time. A rich man would sacrifice a goat, but a poor person would sacrifice a pigeon. If you go to an Islamic country, you're going to see a proliferation of two types of wild, so-called wild but domestic animals, cats and pigeons. That's because Muhammad had a great affection for cats and was also known to keep pigeons and have a great affection for them. And so Muslims revere animals that Muhammad had a great affection for, and so they keep them safe and they live in harmony with them. So we're going to move on to the world of racing. So I was going to tell you a lot about racing, but then I wrote my friend Bobby Morozic, who used to be the director of Theater Project over here. He was the director there for about 20 years, and his father raised pigeons in Baltimore, and he wrote something much better. But I'll tell you just real quick that a little bit about how pigeon racing works. Most races you like a horse, a dog, you send it off in a direction that it tries to hit the finish line. But a pigeon race works in the opposite way because it takes advantage of the homing instinct. A pigeon is taken away from its home and banded so that it will, with a little gizmo that basically can measure how fast it's going, and then is marked once it gets home, and then they calculate who has the highest average speed, and that pigeon wins the race. And pigeon racers are kind of hilarious with how they do this. Like they'll make the home a place that has a lot of food, or a home is a place where it has the ladies, or maybe using the sexual frustration to get them home. But I'll just leave it to Bobby because he says it so much better than I do. Bobby said, what I know of pigeon racing from my dad. My dad bred and raised homing pigeons most of his life, starting when he was about 10, which was 1940 until a few years ago into the 21st century. It may be hard to imagine that pigeon racing was once a wildly popular sport. Many Baltimore boys and men, and girls and women too, kept racing pigeons. A little background: pigeons were the first domesticated birds. Their unique homing instinct was enhanced through selective breeding, and people have been using homing pigeons for racing and carrying messages since as early as 3,000 years ago, probably starting in ancient Persia. Pigeon racing as we know it today seems to have started in Belgium in the 19th century and spread through Europe. It arrived in America in the late 1870s with the latest wave of European immigration. The sport became widely popular in urban centers with large populations of late 19th century immigration like Baltimore. Within Baltimore, pigeon racing proliferated in the neighborhoods in the south, southwest, and north of Baltimore. I'll just stop here and say real quick that right now, pigeon racing is a very working class sport because you can basically, and an urban sport because you can live in an urban area, work a working class job, and you can bend over and pick up a pigeon and make it your friend. And because we deal with a great deal of white flight in Baltimore, what that means is that in terms of the white working class world, the heavy centers of pigeon racing in this area are in Brooklyn and Dundalk and Glen Burnie, but in the African American male world, they're all here in the middle of the city. And I was looking at it the other day. There are these fantastic videos about what guys are doing in the city here. with pigeons and how they build their entire family units around racing pigeons out of their little homes in the middle of the city here. Bobby says, my father grew up in Fells Point and later in the Brooklyn section of South Baltimore. Back then it wasn't very hard or expensive for a young boy to get started in the sport of racing pigeons. All around him would have been boys keeping racing pigeons, and his ears would have been full of the chatter of other boys and the big boys and the men spinning wild yarns and detailed minutiae of pigeons racing. My dad and his best friend Bob, who I named after, started a loft together and began entering pigeons in show and race contests in the early 1940s. I have a lot of fun and curious memories of Dad's pigeon racing. This was in the 1960s and 70s. On Saturdays, us kids would often go with him over town to the main two pigeon feed stores, which were loud and busy with men buying and selling pigeons, grain feed, and other various supplies and equipment. The bigger of the two stores was on Marketplace opposite the fish market, so like where the power plant is now. The other pigeon feed store was located in the corner of Fleet and Ann Streets in Fells Point. It was much smaller and brighter and arranged much like any other old shop with a large long counter with the proprietor stationed behind. In this case, an enormous red-faced man with gigantic hands and incredibly thick neck. One of the two stores were called Central Feed and Exchange, but I can't remember which one. Racing pigeons was a hobby filled with mystery and intrigue, nuance, and ritual, and like most hobbies, it could often take an unlikely amount of time and money, but mostly time. It could also be quite rewarding. There was prize money for winning races and impressive sums for the sale of winners and their offspring and gambling on race results. The stakes were far too small to draw the attention of either law enforcement or criminals. Dad had a highly desirable breed of Janssen. Each bird had a meticulously recorded set of pedigree papers tracing its bloodline back to Belgium. Once in a while, in late winter or early spring, Dad would sequester a pair of pigeons in the basement of our house to achieve a particular breeding pair. Sometimes, to our secret delight, a bird got out of the crate, followed by shrieks of laughter as we chased the poor creature around the house. Skipping ahead, just a little bit more that's really interesting is when he goes on to talk about how they bring pigeons home. So the truck carries them outside of, away from their home, sometimes 50 to 100 miles, and then the pigeon comes back, and as they come back, when it was about time to come in, Dad would release the coasters and tumblers. These birds would take a position high in the sky, directly above Dad's loft, looking out for racing loft mates. The racing pigeon would recognize their loft mates in the sky above their home. The big white birds would coast the racers into the lighter board. Coasters do this by flying tight circles around the loft. Tumblers fly straight up over the loft, throw their head back, and tumble backwards down towards the loft, pull out of the tumble, and repeat until their loft mates come in. It was quite a remarkable spectacle and filled with its own kind of drama. So that's just a little oral history from the son of a pigeon racer. I think it's really interesting. Let's see here. So because of this homing instinct and this speed and agility and ability to find their way around, pigeons have been used in, oh, by the way, this is one of Bobby's father's ribbons for a racing one. Bobby's father won a lot of pigeon races and has these amazing trophies from them. So every single military in the world has attempted to use pigeons at some point to, because of this thing. So, you can shoot a messenger, you can shoot a dog messenger, you can jam an electrical signal, but it is much, much, much more difficult to snipe a pigeon out of the air in the dark. So this has been something that we see is always used by militaries around the world. So, for example, Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, the first word of that was sped to London by pigeons. And this is not military, but in 1851, a guy named Israel Beer Jehoshaphat noticed that there was this bottleneck of information coming through, trying to get information by telegraph from France to Belgium. There was this bottleneck going through Germany, and he decided to innovate a way to overcome that, which was to use pigeon messaging, which, once it started taking off, he changed his name to Julius Reuters and founded one of the largest news gathering organizations in the world. Since the beginning of recorded history, they've been messengers in military warfare. Let's see here. having a lot of, gaining real steam in World War I. If you can't read that, this is an old picture from World War I of a French military homing pigeon. It says, "Military homing pigeons. These are the birds that work to save the lives of our boys in France." And so France was the first one to develop an actual pigeon corps, which then every modern army in the world did. And so there's some stories of some very famous pigeons. There's one, a French pigeon named Cher Ami. And Cher Ami was known for saving the Lost Battalion, which was a battalion of 1,000 French who were stuck in this particular area in Argonne, and were about to be completely bombarded by friendly fire by American bombs, because the American bombs did not realize that they were there. And they released one pigeon after another and watched these pigeons get shot down by Germans, and then they released Cher Ami, who made it. When Cher Ami arrived, she was missing a leg, she had holes in her wings, she was covered in pellets, she was brutally injured, she was missing half of her face, but she managed to deliver this message and save 1,000 lives in Argonne. Cher Ami was awarded the Croix de Guerre, which is the French equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor, for her great bravery for saving so many lives. And to this day, she's actually stuffed in the Smithsonian and standing on one leg for you to come and see her. When the US developed the Pigeon Corps, we called the soldiers who dealt with them pigeoneers. There's another one, Gustavo, who carried the first report of the D-Day landing. There's one named G.I. Joe, who carried a message another message that kept the American artillery in World War II from bombing the English this time. And the English awarded him the Dickon Medal, which is the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross, which is the English equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor. Nazis were known to use pigeons with all the efficiency that they did everything else. Himmler actually declared himself at one point the head of the German National Pigeon Society. And he seized all of the private lofts in Germany and started employing them for military messaging. In response to this, the English became very skilled in deploying peregrine falcons, which liked pigeons. So let's see here. So something related to this particular time period of military pigeon warfare. In the last year, this guy named David Martin in England was renovating his chimney, and his pigeon carcass fell out. And the leg had a message attached to it. The message you can see displayed here, written in code. And it took them a few months, but then a Canadian guy named Gord Young stepped up and decoded it. It's not that interesting. It just shows it just talks about the location of German troops for the English to know. But it was fascinating that this piece of history delivered by a pigeon has just only been unearthed recently. Let's see. More funny facts. B.F. Skinner tried to develop a pigeon missile guidance system in which the missile would basically follow the pigeon. They didn't let him finish that. When we destroyed Saddam Hussein's communication network in Iraq during the Iraqi War, he resorted to pigeon messaging to continue moving his military along as best that he could. And to this day, Iraqi insurgents employ pigeon messaging to subvert what we do. So, enough war, I'm a pacifist. So, where am I? Exotic pigeons. So, So fancy pigeons are funny. That's a rummer powder. There are like thousands of breeds of fancy pigeons, and the fancy pigeon breeds actually, now they're like, I mean, these are sort of the horrendous things that we do to pigeons. There's a whole society and competition that's based on breeding for really crazy characteristics in pigeons that originate from, more disparate species that had unusual characteristics that we just sort of kept elevating. Darwin himself includes some of this type of breeding in The Origin of the Species. He went to the Galapagos, and one of the things he noticed was these very unusual breeds of pigeons, and so he went home and he started doing it in his backyard. So just for giggles, that's a Brunner powder. Jacobin pigeons. Jacobin pigeons are probably one of the most popular fancy pigeon breeds, and they're very pretty. And they were a favorite of Queen Elizabeth. She liked them very much, and it's thought that perhaps she drew the inspiration for those high collars that she wore from Jacobin pigeons. We have the poor fantail. This is the pigeon I feel the worst for. That's a fantail who's doing pretty good because you can see its head. I mean, a lot of fantails have their head actually buried between their tail and their chest, and you can just see the beak peeking out, and you have no idea how they operate. The Saxon field is very distinctive. Back it up a little bit more. The crown peacock, which is crazy. Looks like a peacock. That is not one that we did. That is a naturally occurring species of pigeon. That's the pink neck green, and that's a tropical pigeon right there. So you can see pigeons like that in Hawaii and Papua New Guinea and all kinds of countries that are close to the equator. And I love them. So let's see here. Darwin, one of the things that Darwin sort of pulled out about when he was, one of the discoveries he sort of came up with for the origin of the species when he was working on pigeons was that he noticed if you blended genetic characteristics that they began to take on each other's shape and become less distinctive, which is true, but then Mendel also started working on pigeons, and there's the whole Darwin-Mendel flim-flam that took place, but what Mendel pulled out of that was also that genetic codes didn't disappear, that they could reappear later in generations, which he did discover through looking at pigeons. Pigeons are also sometimes bred to do weird things. Bobby alluded to that a bit in what he was saying about his father's profession. There are parlor rollers, which just stand and then they just continuously somersault backwards until you make them stop. Like, they'll just do this for a while. There are tumblers, which all they do is they fly up into the air and then they do these death spirals down to the ground, and then they fly up again and do it again. People like to shoot pigeons, like the aristocracy and Ernest Hemingway. No good. Let's see here. Pigeon control. Pigeon control is comedy. So pigeons are homers, right? They decide where their home is, and then they stay there, and they come back. You can put a pigeon on the other side of the world for 30 years, and once you give it a chance to do what it'll do, it'll come all the way back if it can. And pigeons have this really incredible sense of direction. They can read. They have a sixth sense, which is located in this little funny crest above their neck, above their beak, which is their sensitivity to the Earth's magnetic fields. And it was actually recently uncovered. Cellular scientists are beginning to figure out that they actually contain brain cells that can map the pattern of magnetic fields around the world, which is why the more they go, the more they remember, and the more that they are able to find home again. So pigeon control combats this problem, or this amazing trait, as you might say. And it's tricky, because they will go home, and they love city buildings because city buildings are like cliffs. I've been hearing that 2640 has a bit of a pigeon problem. That they're living in a closet because of a hole in the ceiling, and poor Kevin Blackstone keeps having to chase them out of the closet. And I have suggestions for him, but the main thing would be to get that hole fixed. But then there's this whole process of netting, which takes place. The guys who have to do indoor pigeon control hate their jobs because of the netting, and the pigeons are better at this than they are. In the pigeon control world, the type of pigeon control that is the joke of the profession is an owl. Some people like to get a fake wooden owl and put it on their building and think that that's going to scare these pigeons away, which it will not. So when you read about pigeon control guides, they're like, if they hear another method that doesn't work very well, they'll go, might as well get an owl if that's what you're going to do. The most effective form of pigeon control is netting. And if you've ever done jury duty or even just walked close to our courthouse, you won't really notice that it's netted until you're right up close. But it has this very thin, small netting that's all around it. And so it has no pigeons. Netting is humane and it's safe, and it makes it very difficult for them to land anywhere. So, and it works the best. There are terrible versions like you know, nixolite, which is the spiky metal on the ledges, avitrol, which is pesticide-laden bird food, which is the worst thing because then you have dead pigeons everywhere, and generally this is in tourist landmarks that people are trying to do this, and it's not very good for your city's PR to have dead birds everywhere. Also, then your endangered species that eat these birds eat it, and then they die. And there are all these, it's funny because there are all these like misconceptions about, you know, so the rats with wings thing, which when I posted that I was doing this lecture, my uncle was thoughtful enough to mention to me. You know, and he believes he got a lung infection from pigeons. Well, pigeons don't really carry disease. They're not the same as rats that way. Every shit carries disease. If there's shit, it's got disease on it. Our shit does, dog shit does, pigeon shit does. So if you get disease, you'll get it from shit. And yes, a lot of times, if you allow it to happen, pigeons will shit everywhere. But pigeons themselves are pretty resistant to avian flu, and they've debunked the idea that they carry West Nile virus. People have tried electronic wiring, which really doesn't work. Speakers that emit avian distress signals. Trap and release, which is, you might as well get an owl, because they just come right back. A few years ago, the mayor of London at the time, Ken Livingstone, cleared them out of Trafalgar Square by first getting rid of the guy who was selling the feed, which is important. If you want to get rid of pigeons, you have to stop feeding them. And then he tried to employ peregrine falcons, except that, again, if your tourists are watching living things being killed in your tourist center and eaten on the ground in front of you, this is very bad PR for our city. In Basel, Switzerland, they replaced the pigeons' eggs with wooden eggs, which is actually very effective. But that's a small area, so they're more able to do it. They also reduced areas of feeding, and they concentrate it in lofts that encourages the pigeons to go there, feed, and roost, so they're out of the way of everyone else. Hilariously, with all of this pigeon control, there are just as many pigeon supporters out there, these like activist groups, like there's one in New York called the Pigeon People, that will actively combat this type of pigeon control effort, which is hilarious, their fights. So let's see here. So probably the most effective form of pigeon control that ever took place was controlling the passenger pigeon. This is the species of pigeon which is now extinct. In this picture, so this is a picture of a stuffed one. There aren't any pictures of live ones because they went extinct in 1914, before we were really taking pictures like that. So passenger pigeons have this humongous population in the U.S. They were known because when they were migrating, they would create these big, big blankets that would darken the whole sky. They'd be 3 miles long and 1 mile wide. And you could have your sky dark with passenger pigeons for days with one flock going over it. So in this magazine illustration, you're seeing a flock coming over, and you're also seeing guys shooting them down. So farmers shot them down to keep their fields from getting completely covered in shit, which pigeon shit is actually great. It has a high concentration of nitrate. It's very good for your crops, but not if they're being like completely blanketed in it. But so farmers shot them down. People shot them for food, for sport. The same way anything you think of as vermin, like they just figured they could do this forever. But the thing is that passenger pigeons they're not as fecund as the pigeons we're used to seeing, the gray ones. Like those pigeons could lay, generally will lay like 10 eggs in a year, but passenger pigeons will lay like 1 or 2 eggs in a year. So we did a really good job of knocking them out. And so the only way you can see a passenger pigeon is a stuffed one in a museum. However, I did recently hear something on NPR about how they might be trying to clone it, bring it back. So then we could be doing this again. And then, another just interesting nerdy fact is that one of the pigeon's closest relatives is the dodo, which we also eliminated in much the same way. As soon as we arrived in Mauritania Island with new animals and hunting practices, we took care of the dodo very quickly. This is just funny. No one is doing this, at least as far as I know. Maybe they are, but I thought this was hilarious. That because they're so ubiquitous that, why not make a traffic camera out of them? People eat pigeons. I've never done it yet. I hear they're delicious, but I haven't had that opportunity, and I haven't quite figured out if I want to. And so that's most of what I have to say. I'll just leave you with one more of my favorite stories, which is this guy right here. So Mike Tyson is, if you are not already aware, is a huge pigeon fancier. He has been since he was a young child, and to this day. And there was like a reality show, which I still haven't seen, about him and his pigeons. But some things that are quite, it's just interesting, because there's a way you could suggest that pigeons sort of kicked off his boxing career, which is, when he was like pretty young, he was living in a very poor place in Brooklyn, and he was underfed most of the time. He would sleep in empty buildings and was sort of on his own, but he was also really scrawny, so he was picked on pretty heavily by neighborhood bullies. And so he made friends with pigeons. He also had a lisp, so it was just really, in many ways difficult for him to, socialize very well. But he made friends with all of these pigeons. And one day this older 10-year-old bully picked up one of his pigeons and wrung its neck in front of him and popped the head right off of the pigeon. And Mike Tyson kicked the living shit out of that guy as a little scrawny kid, which eventually then, as he began to be, he then started supporting himself with, burglarizing and other things until he met his, violent things as well, but until he met his
mentor who taught him to channel listen to boxing. And his last fight that I am aware of was with a guy named Kevin McBride, who should have been completely outmatched by Tyson, but Tyson had been so, his career had gone downhill, his strength had gone downhill, his abilities had gone downhill, and he lost that fight and said very little in the press conference, but he did end the press conference by saying that I just want to go home and be with my pigeons. So that is my lecture on pigeons. Yeah, if people have them. Yes.
You mentioned the courtship between pigeons is like fairly fascinating. Can you describe that?
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. Years ago, I went to visit a friend of mine in Japan, and she took me, because of my great love of pigeons, we went to a shrine called the Asakusa Shrine in Tokyo, which is, Japanese big shrines have all these little shrines in them. And she took me there because there was a pigeon shrine. And we walked up to the pigeon shrine, which is just this little thing, about that size. It has a stone pigeon perched on top. And we walk up and there's this whole flock of pigeons just, all just hanging out, moving around this shrine. And I stopped and I was like, oh my God, they're praying. And then I really realized that they were dating at the pigeon shrine. Pigeons, as they are courting each other, this is when you start seeing, I really like to chase pigeons, but gently, you don't catch the pigeon, you just you pace the pigeon. And so pigeons, this is when you start seeing pigeons chasing each other, which I think is hilarious. So you'll see pigeons with bigger throats, which are the males, chasing after ones with thinner throats, which are the females. Or you'll see big throats chasing after big throats sometimes too. The other thing, and they flex their shoulders and they fan their tail and they puff up and they're, just going after each other. And they fly for 2 seconds and land, and then eventually they figure out who is their life partner. And they live together for the 30 years of their lives and raise eggs and never part from their own milk. Alex.
Well, I think there should be like a sequel to Brewster McCloud after seeing you just do that little dance. But I'm thinking about the whole the iridescence thing. Why are their feathers so iridescent? Why do they look so?
I mean, I think when you're looking at the ones that are, like, those aren't the kinds you see in cities. By the way, Mike Tyson
Well,
keeps really healthy pigeons.
City ones are iridescent.
The city ones are iridescent, but these aren't, like, these pigeons right here don't have it. So the iridescence, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it must be camouflage because, you know, as Darwin was trying to figure out, they selected in urban areas to blend in. And I mean, the thing is, they're highly adaptable, which is again why it's really hard to get rid of them on your building. Like, so they'll adapt to every scenario they're in. And so in that case, I would guess it has to do with camouflage, and that the iridescence complements the gray in that way. Yeah.
When the birds are on a mission, do they always complete the mission, or do they get like confused and distracted too?
Well, they only get confused and distracted if there's interference. I mean, like if there's a falcon that goes after them, or something like that. I mean, like the case of Cher and me, like they're really dead set to go home. Like that's like the strongest instinct that they have, and it's that strong that that's what they do with it. So like Bobby, actually, it was too long, so I didn't read the whole thing, but has the story of his father showing him a pigeon that came back from a race with all of this buckshot in its belly. Like and Cherami came back with one leg, half a face, and a hole in her wing. You know, so they really will. You kind of have to kill them, eat them, or find some way to, like, get, confuse them or such, but they'll basically go home. Yeah.
Can you train to have more than one home in their life?
I think so, because I think I've seen that happen, and I think it has to do with motivating with food and sex, basically. So I think you can. I think it takes time. Yeah.
I read in this book that also had a lot of things that ended up being total lies in it. But that pigeons were brought over to the Americas by the French to spread disease. Do you know if that's true?
I don't think it is. I mean, maybe they thought it was, because pigeons don't really carry a great deal of disease. I mean, again, the shit does. I think it was a mode of messaging that they were really into. I mean, again, I certainly then can't say that without thinking that there could have been a sinister motive to all of the ways that we migrated that Europeans migrated to this country. But I think that at that time, people were so reliant on pigeons for fast communication that probably was also in their minds. Any other questions? Yeah.
So, how did you get into liking pigeons so much?
Natural instinct. I don't know. I chased birds as a kid. I was a weird kid. I think I just spent enough time in this city. I mean, I grew up in the city, and that's an element of grace that I saw around me all the time. And I don't know. I think I got really passionate because I relate to the idea of being undervalued, a little dirty, a little urban, and yet with the capacity to have really wonderful grace and style and unknown skills in this way. So. And the more I paid attention, the more of these incredible facts I found out. Yeah.
Based on what you were just talking about, do we have a contract with them? Do they know to get out of the way of our cars? A la the Seinfeld episode where George Costanza actually hits a pigeon?
I think that most Mostly we do, though I think not all pigeons are hip to it. I have seen a pigeon get hit by a car. It's not pretty. They explode, exploding feathers.
Yeah.
It makes my heart sad. Anyone else? All right, thanks, guys.
We will now, as per custom, take a 10 or 15-minute break. And as per custom, the lecture series would encourage you, since this is a community building event, to find someone over the intermission to make out.
Oh.